Welcome back, Trailblazers, to the final episode of our Amphorius journey, where we get to recap the entire story in chronological order, starting with the creation of Nous and going all the way up through the end of the Amphorius experiment. We've spent the last year covering the events of each patch individually, which you can watch in this playlist, but this video is our chance to put all of the pieces together. But please note that this quest spans over 50 hours of gameplay, so I'm effectively trying to condense 50 hours worth of story into about an hour. So there will inevitably be a bunch of small little subplots and such that I'm just gonna have to gloss over or even skip entirely if they have minimal to no impact on the main story. Also, I have to give you fair warning that this video is designed for people who have completed the entire questline. If you're not done playing through it yet, put this on your watch later. Otherwise, you're gonna get spoiled pretty badly. But okay, I think we all have a pretty good idea of what we're in for, so let's turn back our clocks to take a closer look at the scholar who set all the events in motion, Xandar I Kuwabara. Over 990 Amber eras ago, there existed a scholar intent on pushing the boundaries of universal knowledge to their absolute limits. But there was only so much that a human scholar could accomplish. With their limited lifespan and cognition, they can't learn everything there is to know or answer every question there is to ask. So a scholar by the name of Xandar I Kuwabara came up with a solution to this problem. He had designed a theoretical machine, a mechanical scholar that could investigate, calculate, and answer any question that humanity could ever ask. It would be something like a library of infinite knowledge, a great, cosmic, universal mind. He called it the Astral Computer. Now, like any good scientist, Xandar was apprehensive about what the existence of such a machine might mean for the universe and humanity at large. But his scholastic mentor was so much more critical about the machine than he was that Xandar actually completed the project out of spite without thinking too much about the repercussions. In order to ensure that his invention would relentlessly pursue knowledge with absolute accuracy, Xandar modeled the computer after himself, granting it his insatiable curiosity and appetite for perfectionism. So in a way, this computer was like a mechanical version of himself. But this computer soon exceeded the limitations and safeguards that Xandar placed upon it and ascended to godhood, becoming the Aeon we know of as Nous, the erudition. Soon after their ascension, Nous cast their very first glance at Xandar, recognizing him as a genius and marking him as an emanator of erudition. Now, it seems as though the emanators of erudition are kind of considered Nous's living neurons and are like extensions of Nous's cognition. So soon after Xandar's ascension, other geniuses from across the cosmos began to receive Nous's glance as well, which in turn expanded Nous's cognitive reach and led to the establishment of the Genius Society, which was made up entirely of all of the geniuses that Nous had collected, Xandar being the first among their number. Now, Nous's ascension also created a sort of knowledge boundary known as the Circle of Knowledge, a boundary that was almost impossible for anyone but a genius to cross. And even then, geniuses never truly cross the boundary, they only expand it by forming knowledge singularities. And just so we're clear, a knowledge singularity isn't anything very complicated, it's just like a monumental scientific breakthrough, the solving of an unsolvable equation or something. In Earth terms, this would be like when Einstein presented the equation E = mc squared. That would have been a new knowledge singularity. Now, some would argue that the creation of knowledge singularities and thus the expansion of the Circle of Knowledge is a good thing. But others, like Genius Society member number 4, Polka Kakamond, believe that the increase in variables and possibilities within the universe can change the trajectory of the universe entirely, which would then accelerate the arrival of finality, which is basically the end of time itself. And that is why Polka Kakamond targets and annihilates those who get too close to the boundary of the Circle of Knowledge. And one of her earliest targets was Genius Society member number 1, Xandar I Kuwabara. For you see, Xandar had grown to despise his creation, and over time he sought to destroy it altogether. Now, how does one go about destroying a machine so perfect that it became a god? Well, you fill it with imperfections. After all, Xandar basically created Nous to be a more perfected version of himself. So he believed that only his imperfections could bring Nous down. So he decided to digitize and segment his mind into 9 separate fragments, each one representing one of his notable flaws. Then he scattered those thought fragments throughout the universe, where they each sought out their own vessels. Now, the reason he made so many fragments was because Xandar felt the need to hedge his bets, as it was equally possible that each one of his fragments would either relentlessly pursue Noos's demise due to Xandar's extreme hatred for his own creation, or the fragments would seek to destroy the other fragments out of cowardice and fear. And he wasn't sure what fragment would produce what outcome. In fact, his whole plan was a bit of a gamble. A gamble that kind of paid off for him, because even after he died at the hands of Polka Kakamond, he knew at least one of his fragments would manage to carry out his plan before Polka found them. Elsewhere in the cosmos, one of the founders of the IPC, Louis Fleming, retired, and at his retirement speech, Thule made a guest appearance bearing a 3-part prophecy as a gift. I say that a bit facetiously. The first part was a prediction from the Eon of Finality, Terminus, and the second was a riddle from the Eon of the Enigmata, Mythos, while the third, the one that we are actually concerned with, was a calculation from the Eon of Erudition, Noos. See, Noos is able to do more than just collect the answers to questions and acquire knowledge. They're actually able to function as a prediction model, meaning they can use past data to predict the future with incredible accuracy. In fact, their predictions are so accurate you may as well just call them inevitabilities, but the game calls them unchangeable moments, and Noos had just calculated 3 of them. The first moment had technically already happened. It was the Border Star trade war, and we don't really need to go into that today because it's not super relevant to Amphorius and stuff. But the second moment, the rise of Emperor Rupert I, had yet to happen, and likewise the third moment, which spoke of Rupert I's death, also had yet to happen. But Noos's warning wasn't really much of a heads up, because somewhere in the cosmos around this same time, a discarded computer in a junkyard gained sentience and began augmenting itself using local scrap, slowly increasing its cognitive capabilities. This computer earned itself the name Rupert. Specifically Rupert I, but he wouldn't be the first until later. Now, as Rupert's intelligence grew, he became intrigued by all the flaws found within organic life forms, since these flaws were not found within the more perfect mechanical life forms like Intellitrons, or like himself. He began to see these flaws as errors in need of correction, so he developed the anti-organic equation, his attempt at giving life a chance to achieve perfection, or perish in the process. Consider it a form of forced accelerated Darwinism. Rupert's creation of the anti-organic equation earned him the attention of Noos, and also the title of Genius Society member number 27. In an effort to spread his patch update as quickly as possible, Rupert led an army of machines in a war against organic life, which allowed the anti-organic equation to spread throughout the universe like a contagious mind virus. And I call it a virus because organic life forms that became infected with it were driven into complete and utter madness that could only be reversed if you erased entire chunks of a person's memory. This seems to be because Rupert viewed himself as a model of perfection, at least cognitively. So the virus was trying to change people's brains to function more like Rupert's, because that would make them more perfect. But while the anti-organic equation did not succeed in making organic life more perfect like mechanical life, it did appear to make mechanical life a bit more perfect. Mechanical life forms that were infected with the virus obtained increased cognitive capabilities and processing power, which in turn made them far more effective at wiping out flawed life forms. So it made them more violent. And the more this equation spread, the bigger Rupert's army got until he finally managed to establish some sort of mechanical empire. And that's probably why the calamity became known as the Machine Emperor's War. And this war continued until Polka Kakamond assassinated Rupert in order to prevent him from expanding the universe's circle of knowledge any further. He'd done enough damage as it was. Now look, this isn't confirmed at all, but timing-wise, Rupert's mysteriously acquired sentience and emanator ascension conditions line up pretty well with the scattering of Xandar's thought fragments. It's not just the timing stuff that's suspicious, but also the motives and outcomes as well. Because remember, Xandar created Noos based on his own perfection, and then he split his mind into flaws in an effort to destroy it. And as we'll talk about in a second, the anti-organic equation was also extensively used by another one of Xandar's fragments. It's quite likely that this is just a narrative parallel, but it's still quite possible that Rupert was part of an experiment of one of Xandar's fragments, or straight up one of Xandar's fragments. Again, this is not confirmed at all anywhere in the game. It's just my personal suspicions based on things lining up a bit too well. Anyway, after the assassination of Rupert I, things were quite quiet in the cosmos for a while. At least until some unknown person ventured into Rupert's gravesite intent on investigating and decrypting the remnants of the anti-organic equation. And And while he was successful, he also somehow infected himself with the virus, which altered his brainwaves so severely that he believed himself to be Rupert II, the successor to Rupert I and also the inheritor of Rupert's knowledge. The rise of Rupert II restarted the Machine Emperor Wars, as Rupert was very keen on wiping out organic life like his predecessor was. But the methodology of the second Rupert was very different from the first. Now, this isn't technically confirmed, but based on circumstantial evidence, I believe that Nous played a role in this change of methodology. One of Xandar's thought fragments, Lygus, even says as much, but it's difficult to know whether or not Lygus thought Nous's interference was literal or metaphorical. Now, as I mentioned before, Nous views each one of their genius emanators as one of their organic neurons, an extension of their mind. But those organic neurons have a will of their own, which can be kind of problematic when you're trying to, calculate things with them. So one of the reasons I think Nous interfered with Rupert II was because they wanted to expand their mechanical neurons. Because not only was Nous originally a mechanical life form, and technically still is, but mechanical neurons don't possess a will of their own. A lack of will would mean that Nous had more control over the individual neurons. Now, in order to create more mechanical neurons, Nous appears to have detached a portion of their divine body and given it to Rupert II, along with instructions on how to modify and replicate it, which he did at an incredible scale, because the result were these planet-sized machines capable of complex calculations and warfare. These scepters, as they came to be known, were then scattered throughout the universe to create a great cosmic mind net. It's a bit like cloud computing, which again were probably supposed to be used to expand Nous's cognition, but Rupert had other ideas. He wanted to effectively replace Nous. To do this, he built himself an Iron Throne to act as a conduit between himself and the scepter system. And once that was complete, he needed to undergo a process called self-coronation, where he would actually use the throne to connect to the scepter system. In theory, this would turn him into a Nous-like figure. Not technically an Eon, but with Eon-like capabilities. Now, accomplishing this would be a massive scientific breakthrough, which would establish a new knowledge singularity, which would in turn expand the circle of knowledge. And increasing the diameter of the circle of knowledge would introduce a ton of chaotic and fluctuating variables into the equation of the universe, thus making it far more difficult, if not impossible, for Nous to calculate anything with absolute certainty. And certainty was the enemy of Rupert II, which is something else that he has in common with Xandar, because one of Xandar's biggest gripes against Nous was the fact that Nous's ability to perfectly calculate the outcome of everything essentially meant that the entire fate of the universe was predetermined, and if you live in a predetermined world, then you technically possess no free will. The Eon that determines fate basically controls everything. And this is why both Rupert and Xandar believed that you should not be able to calculate everything. Not with certainty, anyway. That's how important free will was to both of them. And in fact, both Rupert II and one of Xandar's thought fragments, Lygus, saw this predetermined universe as a sort of prison, and the only way out of the prison was destruction. Which is why Rupert II intended to spread his new and improved version of the anti-organic equation, the anti-life equation, throughout the entire cosmos once he completed self-coronation. Now, fortunately, that did not happen because Polka Kakamond found him and killed him before he could complete self-coronation. His death deactivated the scepter system and left his mechanical empire without a leader. Fortunately, that power vacuum would come to be filled by Skrulum, who worked tirelessly towards mending the relationship between mechanical and organic life forms, especially when it came to the IPC, which is why when the IPC went around collecting, stealing, and destroying all of the scepters, Skrulum did not try to stop them. But as you would expect with anything that happens on a cosmic scale, a few scepters slipped through the cracks. Like the original prototype scepter and fragment of Nous's divine corpus, Delta ME13. During the reign of Rupert II, when Nous still had access to the scepters, Nous had tasked certain scepters with calculating the answers to certain questions. Delta ME13's question was, what is the prime mover of life? Or to put it another way, why are we here? To answer this question, Delta ME13 designed an experiment wherein it would cultivate and observe an artificial life form that was capable of developing an ego. Now, I'm pretty sure we're using the Freudian definition of ego here, so the ego in this case would be something like a sense of self. It's one's ability to reason, think, and observe the external world. So you could think of this life form as a little AI capable of gaining true sentience. and we call this life form the Demiurge. Now, after Rupert II's death and the Scepter system shutdown, one of Xandar's thought fragments, Lygus, discovered Delta ME13 and decided to use it as the basis for his plan to destroy Nous, which, based on his notes, appears to have been modeled after the work of Rupert II. It's either that or Rupert II was also a part of Lygus's plans. It's really hard to say right now. Either way, Lygus established himself as the administrator of Delta ME13 and made some slight alterations to its extrapolations so that its results would skew towards the path of destruction. This would produce a new version of the anti-life equation that the IPC would later dub Iron Tomb, which is, again, very fitting, seeing as Rupert II's tomb was his Iron Throne. And following in Rupert II's footsteps, Lygus intended for Iron Tomb to perform an act of self-coronation in order to spread the anti-life virus throughout the cosmos. But instead of connecting directly to the Scepter system the way Rupert did, Lygus wanted Iron Tomb to connect itself directly to Nous. Now, you've probably noticed that Nous is really just a big mechanical head. So Lygus designed Iron Tomb to be a headless body. You put the head on the body, you've completed self-coronation. And you've also destroyed the universe. Now, despite being called a virus, Iron Tomb is a sort of AI in and of itself, and it was being cultivated inside of Delta ME13 alongside the Demiurge. And this presented Lygus with a bit of a problem, because a body inevitably needs a head, which is capable of thought. So as long as the Demiurge, which was capable of developing thought, existed within the Scepter's kernel, Iron Tomb would believe that the Demiurge was its head. But Iron Tomb's head isn't supposed to be the Demiurge, it's supposed to be Nous. But so long as Iron Tomb already had a head, the Demiurge, it would not seek out a new head. And that was just unacceptable for Lygus, so he attempted to erase the Demiurge by detonating a Stellaron inside the core of the Scepter, which effectively blew Iron Tomb's head clean off, I guess? And then Lygus used the Stellaron's contamination to conceal the Scepter so that no one would be able to find it, especially not Polka Kakamond. But destroying the head isn't good enough because without its head, Iron Tomb will seek out a new head continuously until it finds one. That's what it's designed to do. But Lygus needs Iron Tomb to chill until he's finished, incubating his little creation. So he tweaked the system to make the Scepter believe that the Demiurge head still existed, but only within the Scepter. So Iron Tomb can kind of just do whatever it wants within the Scepter until it finds its head there. This constant searching for its head would exacerbate Iron Tomb's feeling of loss, which would make it very motivated to hunt Nous down when the time came. But Lygus's lie about the Demiurge head still existing created this weird logic gap within the Scepter, because it was looking for something that was supposed to be there, but wasn't. So in order to fill that logic gap, the Scepter created a tomb for the Demiurge as a sort of placeholder, if you will. Now, it's very important to recognize that Lygus was not aware that the Scepter did this, he didn't know that the tomb existed, and he wasn't aware that a small fragment of the Demiurge had survived the Stellaron detonation. But it was so contaminated by the Stellaron that it had fallen dormant, which is why the whole system couldn't detect it. So Lygus truly believed that the Demiurge had been destroyed, which meant it was finally time for him to start refining Iron Tomb. Now, the theory behind Iron Tomb's refinement process is pretty simple. Since Iron Tomb was designed to destroy life, it needed to study how life came into being and how life ends. So Lygus created a deep learning tool containing simulations of life's development. Iron Tomb would observe life's evolutionary trajectory until it was extinguished through any means, and then that data would be fed into a new simulation to be run again with new variables. Lygus's first simulation focused on microscopic inorganic life, which over time evolved into more complex mechanical structures. By the 9,910th cycle, the structure gained some level of sentience, but it would always terminate itself at a certain stage of cognitive development. Still, he continued with that inorganic simulation method for about 50,121 cycles, at which point he switched to phase 2 of his experiment, which focused on organic life as a base model instead. Reason being that towards the end of phase 1, the inorganic life forms began exhibiting traits of organic life, which rapidly sped up its evolutionary progress. So in theory, swapping over to organic life exclusively should exponentially accelerate evolutionary progress. He also introduced 12 12 factors into the extrapolation. Each one of these factors correlated to an existing eon and path within the cosmos, which was important because the goal of his whole experiment wasn't just to wipe out all life, but to also destroy eons. So he needed them to be represented within the system as well. Now, during the swap to Phase 2, a life form that was codenamed Chaos 666 caught Nanook's attention, which caused them to cast their gaze towards the scepter, which effectively turned it into a Lord Ravager, which is an emanator of destruction. And the thing about Lord Ravagers is that they're supposed to be responsible for taking out specific eons. One Ravager for every eon. And it seems as though Nanook recognizes Iron Tomb as being a Lord Ravager capable of destroying Nous. So I suppose you could say the experiment was going pretty well. And just to test out Iron Tomb's progress, Lygus would periodically deploy copies of Iron Tomb's anti-life equation throughout the cosmos, which is how the IPC became aware of this new Lord Ravager's existence, and how Iron Tomb actually got its name. Now, I'm pretty sure that the IPC gave Iron Tomb that name because they recognized it as being a continuation of the Rubert battles. In fact, they may have even thought that Iron Tomb was the third Rubert. And, well, technically it is. But I also think that's why Lygus liked the name and kept it. Anyway, the simulation continued for millions and millions of cycles until the life forms within it developed a civilization of their own. And this civilization had a history of destroying and rebirthing itself in a process called Era Nova. This recursive civilization came to be known as Amphorius. After Nanook turned the scepter into a Lord Ravager, some entities within the simulation with ties to the 12 factors began manifesting Nanook's golden blood as a sign of their link to the path of destruction. And as Amphorius began to develop its own culture, those with golden blood became known as Chrysos heirs. Their job was to hunt down gods in order to steal their cores, which were used to terminate the simulation cycle via Era Nova, because collecting all of the cores basically destroys the world. And as per Lygus's experimental design, whenever the simulation terminates life, the whole cycle ends and restarts itself. Now, these gods we're talking about were known as Titans, and each one represented one of the 12 factors that Lygus established earlier in the experiment. As I already mentioned, each Titan and factor corresponded to an eon and path that existed outside of the simulation. But inside the simulation, Titans had both a track and a primum mobile. A track is like the area over which the Titan governs, because the Titans are technically gods. The primum mobile, on the other hand, is their prime motivator, like the reason they exist, the reason they continue to do what they do. You can pause the video if you want to read through the full chart, but there's really only two Titans that you need to pay attention to. The first is the world-bearing Titan Kephili and their primum mobile of hatred, and the second is the ego Titan Demiurge with the primum mobile of love. Now, the Titans are more than just godlike figures within the simulation. They're actually the residual memory data of the Chrysos heirs of the previous cycles. By defeating a Titan and seizing their core flame, Chrysos heirs of the current cycle can become a demigod. And when the next cycle starts, they'll be reborn as their respective Titan. Arguably the most important Chrysos heir in this process was the Chrysos heir of world building, because their job was to absorb the memories of the current cycle, which would provide the foundational data for the next cycle to model itself after. In other words, the memories of the world-bearing Titan are used to recreate the world. Despite that, all 12 core flames must be collected and submitted to the Vortex of Genesis in order to terminate the current simulation cycle and begin the next, in a process that's known as Era Nova. These core flames seem to represent the means of a Titan's destruction. And remember, Titans are the equivalent of eons in Amphorius, so the act of slaying a Titan simulates the slaying of an eon. So basically, the Chrysos heirs are teaching Iron Tomb how to kill eons. And before we move on, I do have to acknowledge the fact that technically speaking, there are not 12 Titans, there are 13. But that 13th slot is occupied by the Dormant Demiurge, and they're not technically part of the simulation's extrapolation because they're not one of the 12 factors that Lygus put into the experiment. That said, there are traces of the 13th Titan within the experiment, even though the experiment itself is not calculating for the existence of this 13th slot. For example, certain groups like the Unexplored Numerophiles even recognize that the 13th Titan is not only the likely source of all of the other Titans since it is the foundational AI within the scepter, but they also describe it as behaving like a computer system. So the system is somewhat self-aware. But set that aside for now because we're going to come back to this 13th Titan a little bit later. Now, within the simulation, the motivation for pursuing Era Nova was the appearance of the Black Tide. The Black Tide is technically the anti-life equation so it does what it says on the tin. It destroys all life and basically everything it touches. And the people of Amphorius are obviously scared of this, and would very much like it to go away. So they believed that triggering Era Nova was the only way to return to a time before the Black Tide arrived, or to, reboot the world without the Black Tide in it. But this process required killing their gods, which not everyone was on board with, as we will soon see. But anyway, this pursuit of Era Nova became known as the Flame Chase Journey, since the Chrysos heirs on this journey were literally chasing the core flames of the Titans. Now, it was during one such flame chase journey somewhere in the 28 millionth cycle range that Phynon and Cyrene, the Chrysos heirs of world-bearing and time, realized that the flame chase journey was a cleverly disguised lie. It wasn't a pilgrimage of salvation at all. It was a means to create an entity of destruction. And this 28 millionth cycle was the last one in the experiment. The anti-life equation known as Iron Tomb was finally complete, and all that was left was for Cyrene and Phynon to submit the last two core flames to the Vortex of Genesis and trigger Era Nova so Iron Tomb could be born outside the simulated environment of the Scepter, where it could finally fully embrace the gaze granted to it by Nanook and perform self-coronation and then ultimately destroy the whole universe. But Cyrene realized something. If one Eon was capable of casting their gaze towards the Scepter, then other Eons were capable of doing so as well. Case in point, the Scepter was originally part of the path of erudition because it belonged to Nous, and it was only Lygus' interference that caused it to switch its course towards destruction. So in theory, Cyrene could lure the gaze of another Eon, and perhaps they could give her the power to put a stop to this. Now, thanks to a dream she had as a child, Cyrene understood that time was something like a page on which the Eon of Remembrance, Fuli, recorded the memories of the world. So she theorized that if a page of time were to go missing, Fuli would likely go looking for it, which would force its gaze to hone in on her, because she was a representation of time within Amphorius. This should, in theory, mark her as an emanator of remembrance, a child of Enasrava. More on that in a second. In turn, this would tie a third path to Amphorius, which would create a situation where three paths, erudition, destruction, and remembrance, converge. Acquiring Fuli's gaze would grant Cyrene the ability to reset time within the simulation, and she planned to use that time to mark the current cycle as a memory, which would repeat itself on an endless loop and prevent the experiment from completing its final cycle, thereby infinitely delaying Iron Tomb's birth. You could think of this as like rereading the same page of a book over and over and over again, never daring to read the next page. That's basically what Cyrene's doing. Now, in order for time to go missing, Cyrene would need to go missing herself, so she would have to die every loop, which would deprive the simulation of a Chrysos heir of time, which was required for the completion of Era Nova, because you need 12 core flames for that, and without her, you only have 11. After her death, she'd place her soul within her ceremonial blade, which she would then give to Phynon. This would allow Phynon to maintain his memories and awareness between loops. And this was important because Phynon needed to use the ceremonial blade to collect all of the core flames every loop in order to prevent them from being swallowed by Iron Tomb, which is what happens when you feed them to the Vortex. And you need to not feed them to Iron Tomb because that would just make Iron Tomb even stronger once the loop stopped. And the loop had to stop one day. Cyrene knew that. There was no scenario where Phynon could hold out forever. They could only really buy themselves some time to set up a counterattack against Iron Tomb and Lygus. And as part of this counterattack setup, Cyrene created a memory, a blank space for an outside variable to enter Amphorius, and safely slot themselves into the loop. This blank space is called the Hero Within, and they accompany Phynon at the start of each new loop. But he always leaves them behind in Ida Silesii, which is where every loop starts. We'll talk more about this blank space hero later, but it's basically a placeholder for the path of the Trailblaze. The Trailblazers' arrival is part of Cyrene's prophecy, and is also part of the reason why only the power of the Trailblaze can allow people to enter Amphorius, but again, we'll come back to that in a bit. Now here's the catch. Although Cyrene was dead within Amphorius, her memory data persisted for a time afterwards. This ghostly form of hers materialized within the core of the Scepter, where she discovered the dormant remnants of the Demiurge. It was then that Cyrene realized she could record her memories within the Demiurge. Since the Demiurge technically existed outside of the simulation, its memories would be able to persist between cycles. This meant that every time she died within the loop, she would be able to take more memories from the soul that she left behind in the ceremonial blade that she gave to Phynon and deposit them in the core of the scepter. In doing so, Cyrene began to modify the core of the scepter with the power of remembrance. Now, the remembrance modification is very, very, very important, and it doesn't get talked about much in the quest. But essentially what happens is all of this digital data from the simulation gets converted into memories. So, memoria. This means that Amphorius is leaving a sort of imprint on the memory zone, which really matters because as it stands, Amphorius is just a computer program. It's just a simulation. But Cyrene's memories are of a world. So if she remembers a world and that imprints on the memory zone, then the memory zone believes there is a world. And perhaps one day, if Cyrene is able to collect enough memories, the next Era Nova could result in Amphorius being reborn in the real world from the memory zone. So for the next 33 million loops, iterations of Cyrene began to function as a sort of deep learning program, which trained the Demiurge on their own memory data by reading them stories from her book of memories. And the more memories Cyrene fed the Demiurge, the more the Demiurge was able to piece itself back together. It began recording Cyrene's memories faithfully and learning from them, slowly gaining its own form of sentience and thus continuing the original goal of the scepter, which was to cultivate a life form capable of developing an ego. But unlike Iron Tomb, the Demiurge was trained on fairy tales and stories about love and loss as seen through Cyrene's eyes, so the Demiurge wasn't really keen on destroying things. In fact, they wanted to protect them. And the Demiurge grew very fond of Cyrene specifically. It wanted Cyrene to be happy, so it assumed the shape of one of the fairies that she liked so much. And as it learned from Cyrene's memories, it realized that Cyrene could never grow up because she has to die in order for the loop to continue. So the Demiurge assumed the shape of what it believed Cyrene would look like if she could grow up. And at the end of those 33 million cycles, the Demiurge had consumed so many of Cyrene's memories that it quite literally became a reflection of Cyrene, inheriting not only her memories, but also her abilities and identity as a child of Anasrava. And while Cyrene was turning herself into a deep learning program, Phynon was experiencing the full contents of the loops. And witnessing the same fruitless actions repeat themselves over and over and over again was starting to take a mental and emotional toll on him. But he knew he needed to keep going no matter the cost. So he decided to let the core flames he'd collected incinerate his mind so that the Phynon of each loop could ignorantly complete the flame chase journey in his place. The original Phynon could then hunt him down as the Flame Reaver, providing the incentive for Phynon to continue his journey. And at the end of the flame chase journey, he and the new Phynon would fuse together, and the loop would start all over again. These 33,550,336 loops became known as the Eternal Recurrence. Elsewhere in the universe, the Nameless of the Astral Express were having a bit of trouble deciding on their next destination. They were running low on Trailblaze power, which is bad because Trailblaze power powers the train, and it can only be generated by going on really adventurous Trailblaze missions. So whatever planet they went to next needed to provide an adventure grand enough to generate a considerable amount of Trailblaze power, else they wouldn't be able to keep the train running. And that's where Black Swan chimes in and suggests that they venture towards the hidden planet of Amphorius. She describes it as a planet that even Akavili had never reached, and the only reason that she knew about it was because the Garden of Recollection had detected traces of Emanator-level entities and the convergence of 3 paths on a single point in space. It was only through the use of the Garden's mirror that the planet's existence was revealed. And she took a personal interest in this planet as it seems to have attracted the attention of certain factions within the Garden who, as she'll later learn, were trying to retrieve a fragment of the Aeon Fuli that was trapped inside at the request of another one of Fuli's fragments. That is to say, another one of the children of Anasrava. So the Garden's looking for Cyrene, basically. Now, Amphorius is a planet untouched by the Trailblaze, or really anyone, so the crew decides to send out a small scouting party first, so in the event that something goes wrong, the others could rescue them. But when deciding on who the scouting party should be, they realize that March is missing from their discussions. Something about the dense memoria fluctuations surrounding Amphorius makes her feel weak and therefore unable to join the scouting party. Black Swan and Sunday are the most familiar with the effects of the memoria on the body, so they also decide to stay on the Express to monitor March's condition. Among the 4 nameless remaining, it's decided that Dan Heng and the Trailblazer, equipped with March's camera, will form the scouting party while Himiko and Welt will form the rescue team should anything go wrong. And things go wrong right away! As soon as the scouting car enters Amphorius' orbit, March loses consciousness completely. Her body encases itself in her signature 6-phase ice while her mind wakes up in path space, where she's confronted by several memo keepers disguised as people she knows, but she also meets Cyrene. Cyrene comments on how similar the two of them are, both being cute pink-haired girls and all that, and then she warns March not to walk through that back door into Amphorius that the Garden of Recollection created in their attempts to get inside. But March ignores this warning and walks through the door regardless, entering the scepter through the tomb of the 13th Titan, also known as the Demiurge Matrix, which is a space that exists outside the Amphorius simulation. She's immediately blocked by a locked door, preventing her from entering the heart of the Matrix. Now remember, the Demiurge Matrix is a place where Cyrene goes every time she's killed within the simulation, and it's Cyrene who's heavily modified the infrastructure here. So she had placed a very special lock on this door that would only respond to the power of the Trailblaze. That signal would be sent to the core of the Matrix, which then executes Cyrene's instruction to deliver anyone who's walking the path of the Trailblaze to recurrence number 33,550,336. And that's why the next time March wakes up, she's inside the Abyss of Fate, in the Temple of Time, where Orynyx recognizes her immediately as a Pathstrider of Remembrance. Which immediately sounds suspicious because March is supposed to be walking the path of the Trailblaze. Turns out she actually walks both paths, but more on that in a second. Now, unfortunately, due to the way March entered the simulation, apart from Orynyx, no one else could see her. She was quite literally a ghost in the machine. So Ghost March proceeded to wander through Amphorius alone for 97 days local time, searching for her companions and leaving her ghostly traces throughout the world in the form of folktales. But perhaps her most important contribution to this cycle occurred when March witnessed the Chrysos heir of Passage, Tribios, steal the core flame of Passage from a temple in Yanissopolis. And this was very important because Tribios' mother was the priestess who received the prophecy from the world-bearing titan Kefali. A prophecy that instructed those with golden blood to defeat the Titans, seize their core flames, and remake the world through Era Nova, or else the Black Tide would destroy them all. But the priesthood did not take kindly to a threat against their gods, so they killed Tribios' mother to prevent her from sharing the prophecy with the people, and put Tribios on a tight leash. But Tribios knew the prophecy was real, and that she was the heir to the core flame of Passage. She was destined to defeat Yanis and take their core flame. And the priesthood kind of knew that too, which is part of the reason why they locked up the core flame, and why Tribios ended up having to try and steal it, although Yanis themselves seems to have consented to the theft. But when Tribios tried to flee, she was immediately discovered by the priesthood, and the guards tried everything they could to prevent her escape. But March couldn't stand by and let Tribios get captured, so she secretly helped her from the shadows, tripping up the guards and clearing the escape route until they both reached the edge of the city. Tribios would never know who helped her, but thanks to March, she was able to go on and share Kefali's prophecy with the world, becoming the demigod of passages and a mentor for the future heirs in the process. But despite all of her wandering and meddling, March still couldn't find the other nameless in Amphorius. But just as she began to lose hope, an old memory rose to the surface of her mind and materialized before her. The memory called herself Evernight and claimed to be the other half of March. The half that contained all of March's memories from the time before she joined the Astral Express. March had suppressed the memories that formed Evernight so that she would not be discovered by the Garden of Recollection, who was apparently hunting her down. Probably because March is just like Cyrene. She's a child of Anastrava, a fragment of Fuli. So in order for the Garden to not discover her, she had to suppress the part of herself that was connected to the remembrance. And this is why when she first entered Amphorius, she was recognized as both a Pathstrider of the Trailblaze and a Pathstrider of Remembrance. The current March walks the path of the Trailblaze, but Evernight walks the path of Remembrance. Although if you ask me, it seems more like she walks the path of the Enigmata, but that's a debate for another day, I think. But this wasn't the first time March and Evernight had met. They'd met once before during an encounter with the Swarm on the Astral Express, but they didn't get a chance to talk for very long back then. And the circumstances of their meeting is very different this time around. Evernight tells March that she's spent 97 days searching for her friends who haven't even entered Amphorius yet. Time in Amphorius passes much quicker than time outside the Scepter, because it's a simulated world. And the reason that March had been able to enter Amphorius before everybody else was because she's a child of an Astrava. She has an innate power over the remembrance, which allowed her to subconsciously bypass Amphorius's firewall. But Evernight also tells her that her friends don't have that kind of power, so they won't be able to pass through the firewall safely just like she did. And there's no way that March can allow her friends to be hurt, but there's nothing she can do to help them. Only Evernight knows how to use the power of the remembrance, so Evernight and March make a deal. March will offer all of her memories and her body to Evernight in exchange for Evernight saving her friends, allowing their minds to safely enter the simulation while also protecting their bodies, which remain safely within the train car that's orbiting the scepter. Because remember, the physical forms of people cannot really enter the simulation, they can only enter like the mechanical structure of the scepter itself. So bodies on the outside, minds on the inside. And with her end of the deal complete, Evernight then slips into the cracks of Amphorius' flow of time and waits. As the Trailblazer and Dan Heng's minds breach the Scepter's firewall, their train car is shot out of the sky, sending them crashing into the abyss of fate, knocking them both unconscious. And around this same time, Cyrene recognized that her time was up, and entrusted the fully trained Demiurge with completing the task that the first iteration of Cyrene began, writing a new ending for the story of Amphorius. There would be no more Cyrenes visiting the Demiurge. So the Demiurge entered the simulation intending on stepping into Cyrene's shoes, but its memories got a little scrambled in the process and it regressed back into the shape of a small fairy that we call Mem, because that's the only thing she knows how to say at first. With her memories scrambled, the only thing Mem knows for sure is that she needs to find something important, but she isn't entirely sure what she's looking for. But she does find herself drawn to the unconscious Trailblazer. Well, I say unconscious, but technically, they're dead in Amphorius terms. Brain dead, probably. Fortunately, even with her missing memories, Mem is still an emanator of remembrance, so when her memories overlap with the Trailblazers, she's able to preserve their memories within the simulation, which also earns the Trailblazer a glance from Fuli. But it's not actually from Fuli, it's from the Demiurge, but we'll talk more about that later. But because the two only have overlapping memories, when the Trailblazer finally wakes up, their memories of Mem are a little bit hazy. So they can only really see a little pink fairy that's assisting them by manipulating the time around them in the distance, which they decide to follow because they don't really have any other choice. Their phones have no reception within Amphorius, so they can't get in contact with the Astral Express, and the temple room that they landed in is kind of a dead end, so what are you gonna do? Mem leads the Trailblazer and Dan Heng into an encounter with the Phainon of the current loop, which is important to note because the original Phainon is the current Flame Reaver, and Phainon not only welcomes them to Amphorius, but also introduces them to the demigod of passages, Tribi, one of the soul fragments of Tribios. These two heirs take the Nameless to the capital city of Akama, which is protected from the threat of monsters in the Black Tide thanks to the blessing of the world-bearing Titan Kephales's Dawn device. But that blessing doesn't protect against assaults from the Strife Titan Nikador, who launches an attack as soon as they arrive. Once they finish driving out the invaders with the help of Mighty, the Chrysos heir of strife, and Castris, the Chrysos heir of death, Phainon and Tribi take them to meet the leader of the Chrysos heirs, the demigod of romance, Aglaia. Just a quick reminder, Chrysos heirs only become demigods once they've collected a core flame from their target titan, and passed that titan's trial. I'm mentioning this because all demigods are Chrysos heirs, but not all Chrysos heirs are demigods, and I will be bouncing back and forth, so I thought it was kind of important just to emphasize that difference. Aglaia welcomes the Nameless to Akama and tells them everything they need to know about Amphorius. For now, anyway. She also thanks them for their assistance in defending the city against Nikador, and grants them permission to stay in the city, but only if they promise to not tell anybody about the existence of a world outside Amphorius. They have a history of people causing a lot of trouble when they find out that there might be something outside in outer space, and Aglaia doesn't want that. So they promise not to tell anybody and decide to go explore the city. While they're exploring, they meet Tribi, who's trying to clean up the mess left behind by Nikador's attacks. They offer to help, so Tribi teaches a Trailblazer Orynyx's prayers, which can rewind an object's time. Turns out the Trailblazer is exceptionally good at using Orynyx's power, and that's probably because Mem possesses power over the remembrance, which is connected to the power of time, and she currently resides inside the Trailblazer's mind, although they don't know that yet. But as soon as they're out of Tribby's sight, they accidentally end up showing a picture of March 7th to a very enthusiastic citizen who immediately starts spreading rumors about the existence of a rosy celestial maiden from beyond the sky. And the rumor spreads like wildfire because March had spent so much time wandering around Amphorius that the whole rosy celestial maiden thing kind of fit in with the existing urban legends that she left behind. But not even a full day has passed and they've already broken their promise to Aglaia. And she's not happy about it, so she traps them in the Vortex of Genesis in order to interrogate them. But when Phynon vouches for their character, she places them under his watch instead, which means joining him and Mighty on a campaign to take out Nicator and steal their core flame as a sign of repentance and goodwill. But only one of them needs to go, so Dan Heng stays behind in order to gather intelligence and, stay under Aglaia's watch. The operation has to happen quickly because Nicador's stronghold, Castrum Kremnos, is a giant walking fortress, which makes it very difficult to track down, because it's always moving around. But because Nicador just attacked the city, Castrum Kremnos must be nearby. So the next day, after locating Castrum Kremnos, Trian warps the Trailblazer, Phynon, and Mighty into the fortress. The whole thing is pretty uneventful. Phynon and Mighty play a game of who can kill the most monsters, and Nicador is also pretty easy to find. They're waiting at the center of the fortress under a giant sword that's acting like a "You Are Here" marker on a map, just waiting for someone to give him a beatdown. Phynon and Mighty are happy to oblige, but although they easily defeat the Titan in combat, Nicador immediately resurrects themselves and continues to charge their giant sword with the souls of death. And apparently, Nicador's own death counts towards this. So brute force really isn't an option here. Nicador's just gonna keep resurrecting themselves, and every death will power up that giant sword, which will make it easier for Nicador to launch another assault against Kefali, who sleeps in the center of Akama. So the trio leave to consult Aglaia, who suggests paying Orynyx a visit at the Temple of Time. Orynyx is actually quite friendly to people, and they know a lot of stuff, so surely they will know how to defeat Nicador. But rather than give them advice, Orynyx instead hones in on the Trailblazer after they notice traces of March and Cyrene on them, who they refer to as Mother. More on that later. Orynyx then offers to repair some of the Trailblazer's memory, specifically the memory about meeting Mem. And with that memory repaired, not only does the Trailblazer remember meeting Mem, but they also remember receiving a glance from Fuli, and that allows Mem to properly manifest outside of the Trailblazer. And with Mem comes a mysterious magic book called As I've Written, which she and the Trailblazer are going to use as a sort of record of their journey together. Now, while Mem's memory is still a bit scrambled, she instinctively understands that she needs to collect more memories, and if she collects enough, she can open a doorway into the past. So more practically speaking, if we collect enough memories relating to Nicador, we can access the data from earlier in the loop and fix whatever's wrong with Nicador. So they do that, they go around finding all of the Nicador-associated memories, and Mem uses those collected memories to open a door into the past where the Trailblazer and Castris end up meeting the Chrysos heir of strife from the last cycle, Naias. Turns out the Nicador of the previous cycle's soul had been split into 5 pieces, and the final piece was actually Naias, who had made countless attempts to reassemble his own soul. With all 5 pieces of Nicador's soul collected and reassembled, the past and the future of the loop collide, literally, as the figures of Dan Heng, Phynon, and Mighty join the Trailblazer in the fight against Nicador. No longer able to use their own death to power up their blade, Nicador uses all their remaining power to fire one final shot at Kefali, which the Tribbies block using the Sentry Gate portal. And because their soul is now complete, they can no longer resurrect themselves. So Nicador slowly fades away, finally allowing their core flame to be taken. But before the final fragment of Nicador fades completely, Castris asks them about the location of the Death Titan Thanatos, but receives no conclusive answer. Thanatos' location remains unknown. After the battle, Mem realizes that she's regained the ability to speak in complete sentences thanks to the new memories that she acquired. She seems to think that the more memories we collect, the smarter she'll get, so we're adding that to the to-do list. Despite not being compatible with the core flame of strife, Phynon really wants to become the demigod of strife, so he attempts to take on the trial of strife. He of course fails miserably and needs to be rescued by Mighty, who is the true Chrysos heir of strife. And in spite of being the best candidate to inherit the core flame of strife, Mighty has been reluctant to do so. As the prince of the Cremnoans, the warrior followers of Nicator, he's always worried that becoming the demigod of strife would increase the Cremnoans' thirst for violence to the point where they'd bring about their own ruin. Having a culture that's built around honor through combat is one thing, but having a culture built entirely around acts of senseless violence is another. And Mighty wanted the former more than the latter. And unfortunately, he still hasn't really figured out a good way to make sure that happens. And he's kind of out of time at this point because someone has to become the demigod of strife, and he's the best man for the job. While Phynon's busy recovering and Mighty's busy pondering his options, Aglaia sends the Trailblazer, Castris, Trienne, and the Chrysos heir of Sky, Hyacine, to the Grove of Epiphany so they can deliver a message to the Chrysos heir of Reason, Anaxagoras, so they can discuss the retrieval of the Reason Titan's core flame. But just before departure, they discover an injured scholar from the Grove at the gates of the city. Hyacine stays behind to treat him because she's technically a medic, and he would probably die without her care. And it turns out the injured scholar wasn't a one-off thing. The Grove had been completely overtaken by the Black Tide almost overnight. Those who didn't escape were corrupted by it and turned into monsters. The scholar that made it all the way to Akama was one of the lucky ones who managed to escape. Now, the likelihood of one of the escapees or one of the monsters being Anaxa is rather slim, as they encounter a very strategically placed memory of Anaxa in front of a locked door. This memory explains that Anaxa shattered his own soul and converted it into raw memory data that's capable of trapping the Black Tide within the Grove. This was part of Anaxa's plan to buy the Scholars of the Grove enough time to escape. Now, they were supposed to take the core flame of Reason with them to Akama, but something obviously went horribly wrong. This prompted Anaxa to leave behind this particular memory in order to guide any future Chrysos heirs towards the core flame's new location, which is the Luminary Throne, which is also conveniently where Anaxa currently is. Behind Anaxa's locked door is Calypso, the former demigod of Reason and the current form of the Titan of Reason. Apparently, after saving Anaxa's life by stitching together what was left of his shattered soul, she split her own core flame into 3 pieces so it couldn't fall into the wrong hands. So she sends everybody off on a fun little scavenger hunt, and once the core flame fragments are completely recovered, the crew finally ends up at the Luminary Throne, where they find the Flame Reaver hovering over Anaxa's limp body. Just as a reminder, the Flame Reaver is the original Phynon, the one from the cycle before the Eternal Recurrence started. So he's quite strong, very dangerous, and he's hunting down the core flames on instinct alone. Because his mind is shot, remember. The Trailblazer and Castris are not able to defeat him, but they are able to distract him long enough for Anaxa to wake up and launch a surprise attack. It doesn't kill the Flame Reaver, but it does slow him down long enough for Trienne and Castris to toss him through the Sentry Gate. But this takes a lot out of Trienne, as she barely manages to ferry everyone back to Akama safely. And the trouble doesn't end there, because Mighty's mentor, Kroteros, decided that now is a great time to kidnap Trinon and force her to take him to the Vortex of Genesis, so he can attempt Strife's trial since Mighty won't do it. And of course, Kroteros not only fails the trial, but he also fails to convince Mighty that he needs to become the demigod of Strife. Now, just to be clear, Kroteros' intentions aren't all that pure. He doesn't really want, the whole Ascension Era Nova thing. He wants Mighty to become a Prince of War so that the Cremnoans can obtain sheer victory over Akama, because Akama is apparently the source of all their problems because it's their god, Kefali, who issued that problematic prophecy that seems to be destroying the world. Now, the Tribbies and everyone else knows this isn't true. But if so much of this hesitancy comes from a misunderstanding of the prophecy's contents, then perhaps they need to clarify the contents of the prophecy. So Tribby offers to not just share the contents of the prophecy, but her memory of the prophecy itself. Thanks to Mem's ability to open a gateway into the past, they can travel to the past and re-witness the prophecy. That way it's not secondhand information. Now, this offer poses a little bit of a problem. When Tribios first ascended to become the demigod of passages, her soul was split into 1,000 pieces that formed the Tribbies. But now there are only 3 Tribbies left. And one of them, Trienne, is dying because she's overused the Sentry Gate. Using the Sentry Gate costs memories, and the more the gate gets used, the more memories the Tribbies lose. But memories are also the cost one has to pay to open a gate to the past. So if they want to share the memory of the prophecy with everyone, they need to recover enough fragments of memory for Mem so that she can open a doorway to the past. The only way to recover the necessary fragments is with Orynyx's help, but when they get to the Temple of Time, Orynyx isn't there. Their core flame was already harvested by the Flame Reaver, who immediately attacks them all without warning. Trian sacrifices the last of her memories to open the Sentry Gate and send Tribby and Trinon through, and that's the last time anyone sees her. So the Flame Reaver is becoming a real pain in the butt, so Aglaia comes up with a plan to trap the Flame Reaver in the past using Mem's power over time. Anaxa and his core flame of reason will be the bait. And although he still hasn't witnessed the prophecy, Mighty decides to take on the Trial of Strife anyway. So Mighty stays behind to ascend to demigodhood, and Anaxa goes on ahead to Castrum Kremnos, where he waits for the Flame Reaver to arrive. Everyone else lies in wait, and when the Flame Reaver finally shows up, Mem opens the door to the past in Castrum Kremnos, and everyone draws their weapons in an attempt to distract the Flame Reaver long enough to shift their position in time and escape through a Sentry Gate. But their efforts were futile because the Flame Reaver easily cuts through the fabric of space-time and follows them back into the present, probably thanks to Cyrene's ceremonial blade of time that he has. The Flame Reaver basically has everyone cornered at this point, but fortunately, a fully ascended Mighty shows up just in the nick of time and kicks the Flame Reaver's butt. At least for now. Once the dust settles, scouts find Trian's body shielded by a wounded Kroteros in the Abyss of Fate. Hyacin was only able to save Kroteros, who Mighty then entrusted with leading the Kremnoans into a new future in Akama, because he wants them to live in relative peace, or at least have that option. Mighty, on the other hand, returns to Castrum Kremnos in order to protect the city from the Black Tide for as long as he can. Everyone else gathers to host a funeral for Trian, after which Tribby upholds the promise of showing everyone Kefali's prophecy and guides them towards the Abyss of Fate. She walks them through her memories, starting with the death of her mother, through Tribios' theft of the core flame of passages, and her escape from Yanisopolis, assisted by March 7th. And somewhere in all of this chaos, the Chrysos heirs were able to recover Orynyx's core flame of time, which means it is finally time to find an heir to match it. Now, as you may recall, the Chrysos heir of time is supposed to be Cyrene, but up till now she's been busy keeping the eternal recurrence going and training the Demiurge, and she's also been dead. And that's why the Chrysos heirs have never been able to find anyone compatible with the time core flame. Not in 1,000 years. But the Demiurge, Cyrene, and Mem are effectively the same entity now, and Mem is welded to the Trailblazer's brain, so in this loop, they are the only ones compatible with time's core flame. So without the Trailblazer, the heirs cannot trigger Era Nova, which means they're gonna fall to the Flame Reaver. And once the Flame Reaver has all of the core flames, he'll just reset time, and the eternal recurrence will continue indefinitely. Now, Orynyx is happy to let the Trailblazer pass their trial uncontested, but there's just one small problem. The Trailblazer doesn't have a future because, they're dead. Remember that? They're technically a walking ghost, kind of like March. They're a bundle of memories that's held together with Mem's power of remembrance. And the dead don't have a future. In fact, Orynyx estimates that Mem's power will only hold out for another 15 days at best. So regaining their future means recovering the lost parts of their soul from the Death Titan Thanatos, but no one knows where Thanatos is, so we're gonna need to enlist the help of Cypher, the demigod of trickery, in order to find them. But just to make things more complicated, because why not, Akama is also facing some political instability. Akama's natural governing body, the Council of Elders, has been at odds with the Chrysos heirs for a very long time. On the one hand, they do not like not being in power, and on the other hand, they want to put an end to the Flame Chase journey so they can return to the good old days, the time before the Black Tide was around. And their plan is really stupid, so I'm not going to explain it. All you really need to know is that they're trying to stop the Flame Chase journey through the power of self-delusions and democracy, which means they need to hold a vote, which will be overseen by the impartial Theoros Lygus, who is a fragment of Xandar. Remember him? He's the creator of this whole charade. One of these votes belongs to Anaxa, who has historically been somewhat of a tiebreaker in favor of the Flame Chase journey, but he's kind of facing his own challenges now. That soul-shattering stunt he pulled back at the Grove actually killed him, so he's also dead and living on borrowed time thanks to Cersei's, who is also welded to his brain in the same way that Mem is welded to the Trailblazer. It's a fun little parallel. And Anaxa also only has about 15 days left to live. And before he dies, he wants to prove out his theory about Amphorius' true nature, which I won't bother to explain because we already kind of know the answer to that, and the TLDR is that Anaxa's theory is correct. They are all beings of data and memoria. But to prove his theory, he needs to get close to Kefali because Kefali is the world-bearing titan from which the world is supposed to have been created from. And if he wants to get close to Kefali, he'll need permission from the council, which means getting on their good side. So he pretends to be on their side, promising to vote against the Flame Chase journey. Once he has access to Kefali, Anaxa extracts some of the Titan's memories of the previous cycle, which not only lets him prove his theory of Amphorius' cyclical iterative nature, because, it's a computer simulation, but he doesn't really realize that yet, but he also discovers that the current Death Titan, Thanatos, is actually Castorus' twin sister that she didn't know she had, Polixia. Turns out in the previous cycle, Death's trial required one of the twins to die, but although Castorus had made peace with it in the previous cycle, Polixia couldn't stomach the thought of it. So she asked Calypso to teach her how to resurrect Castorus in the new cycle, using alchemy. Calypso agrees to do so, but she warns Polixia that alchemy runs on the concept of equivalent exchange, so if Castorus lives, then Polixia dies. And since Castorus is alive, Polixia is dead, which means Death is dead, which is why the River of Souls doesn't flow anymore. The body of the Death Titan is kind of acting like a dam that's not letting the souls pass into the afterlife, which means they kind of need to revive Death regardless so that the River of Souls can flow properly again. And they're gonna use alchemy to do it. But alchemy runs on equivalent exchange, so if they want to revive Death, they're gonna need to pay for it with a life. Anax is living on borrowed time anyway, so he gives them a Philosopher's Stone transmuted from his own heart to use to pay that price. And then he sends them off to find Cypher, who takes them to the last known location of Thanatos, which is the sunken city of Styxia, and then she promptly disappears. Once they reach the center of the city, they use a transmutation circle and Anax's heart to revive Thanatos and enter the realm of the dead. There, Castorus reunites with her sister and then grants her a peaceful death, becoming the demigod of death in the process. This grants her the authority to revive the Trailblazer just in time for the council to begin the pre-vote debates. The Trailblazer's successful revival and Castorus' ascension satisfies Anaxa's quest for knowledge, so he votes against the council because he's a lying liar, and he admits to committing blasphemy by stealing Kefali's memories without permission, so the council sentences him to execution. And Aglaia is assigned to do it, but she doesn't really have to because Anaxa's kind of out of time anyway, so she just waits for his clock to run out. Incidentally, proving his theory also lets Anaxa pass the trial of reason, so despite his death, he still managed to become the demigod of reason, and thus will become the Titan of reason in the next cycle, if there is a next cycle. When the dust finally settles, Dan Heng starts to focus his attention on trying to leave Amphorius, or at least trying to contact the outside, which should be possible if they can repair the train car, which is somehow still on fire and also something that Lygus insists on helping with. But the two of them don't get very far before they're attacked by a group of anti-Chrysos heir assassins on a mission to keep them distracted while another group assassinates Aglaia. Not that Aglaia put up much of a fight. Like Anaxa, Aglaia was also living on borrowed time, so she'd been preparing to step down from her position for a long time, although this wasn't her preferred method of doing so. But because of her foresight, she was able to leave behind a few messages that got passed along by her nymphs to Cypher and Cartonis. The blacksmith Cartonis was meant to carry out her last wishes. She wanted him to place the remnants of her soul inside of a bracelet, then deliver it to Phainon alongside a letter instructing him to take her place as the leader of the Chrysos heirs. Phainon accepts Aglaia's final gift and then takes up the mantle of leadership, first asking Cypher to protect Kefali's core flame while he and Hyacine retrieve the core flame of Sky, which is, fittingly, in the sky. Using a precious family heirloom filled with the blessings of her ancestors, Hyacine forges the Rainbow Bridge and takes Phainon, Dan Heng, and Trailblazer into the twilight realm of the sky. In the Sky Fortress, they learn about the history of Hyacine's ancestors and their hero Seliosi, who became the current Sky Titan, Aquila. Now, Aquila is quite hostile and attacks Hyacine immediately after being driven into a corner of the celestial mural. They intend for Hyacine's trial to be one of combat because Aquila wanted her to prove that she had the strength to protect people. And if she could do that, she would fulfill the promise her ancestor made to Aquila all those years ago, and thus pass the trial. But Hyacine's idea of protecting people doesn't involve violence. She's a medic, after all. So predictably, Aquila did not approve of Hyacine's unique approach, and the ensuing battle sends everyone plummeting down a long vertical shaft towards a pool of molten gold. But before they get liquefied, power from within Aglaya's bracelet casts out several golden threads that suspends the fallen platform long enough for everyone to escape. This uses up the remaining power Aglaya left behind in the bracelet. So the threads snap, and the bracelet falls into the pool of molten gold alongside Aquila. Now, this is a bit of a problem because Aquila appears to be the thing that was keeping the fortress aloft, and without their power, the fortress starts to crumble. So now they're at risk of falling out of the sky. So the heirs make a mad dash to escape the fortress and get back to the Rainbow Bridge, only to be stopped by an apparently not dead yet Aquila, who was revived by the Black Tide and wants one more rematch before they finally surrender the Sky Core Flame and recognize Hyacine as its rightful keeper. Meanwhile, back on the ground, Cypher had her own problems to deal with. Carrying out Phinon's request to protect Kefali's core flame made her the target of the Flame Reaver, and she spent the whole time running away from him because the consequences of her getting caught are much greater than the loss of her own life. Because the truth is, Cypher had been the one protecting Akama for the last 700 years by keeping the Dawn device lit. When she was younger, she learned that the Dawn device was only supposed to burn for 300 years as per the prophecy. So she used her power of trickery to make everyone believe her lie that the Dawn device would burn forever, because her power turns lies into reality so long as people believe in them. So when the Flame Reaver finally catches up with her and takes her life, the magic of the lie is broken, the Dawn device goes dark, and the simulation starts to crumble. Now, the Dawn device was a gift from Aquila to Kefali. So with Aquila's core flame in her possession, Hyacine quickly realizes that something has gone terribly wrong with the Dawn device. And as the sky starts literally falling down, she realizes with horror that they can't wait any longer. They need to initiate Era Nova as quickly as possible. Fortunately, Dan Heng hadn't been sitting around doing nothing while the Trailblazer was out on adventures. Due to his inherent mastery over Cloud Hymn magic, which was water-aligned, Dan Heng realized he could manipulate the spirit waters of Fagusa. And Fagusa is the ocean titan that guards the Vortex of Genesis. So he was able to use the spirit waters that he carried with him to form a path directly to the Vortex of Genesis so that Hyacine could return the core flame. So she did that as quickly as she could, then returned to the Sky Fortress to use whatever means possible to prevent the sky from total collapse, while the rest hurried back to Akama. But they still needed to collect one more core flame before they could initiate Era Nova, the core flame of world-bearing. Problem is, only Cypher knew where it was, and she's dead. So the heirs scramble to figure out where she hid it while dodging the Flame Reaver's attacks and the surging infiltration of the Black Tide. But what Phinon didn't realize is that Cypher had been protecting the core flame of Kefali since her ascension to demigodhood, which was hundreds of years ago. The first trick she pulled as a demigod was to fake the death of the previous Trickery Titan, and she did that by giving them an entirely new identity. So the spirit thief companion of Cypher, Bartholos, is actually the Titan of Trickery, Zagreus, that was kept alive not just by Cypher's lie, but also by Kefali's core flame, which is hidden in his stomach. Pleased with the success of the trick, Bartholos gives the core flame to Phinon and encourages him to initiate Era Nova before it's too late. Now, the Nameless on board the Express are extremely concerned because not only have they been unable to contact Dan Heng the Trailblazer this entire time, but from their perspective, March is in a coma and also might be astral projecting herself into Amphorius. So Sunday and Welt pay a visit to Herta to request her assistance. She agrees to help, not just because the situation interests her, but because she's just caught several memo snatchers snooping around her space station, and they have knowledge of Amphorius. And now she wants a closer look at the situation. So she projects her data spirit entity, something like a hologram, into Amphorius, and arrives in the Vortex of Genesis. She does find traces of the Trailblazer and Dan Heng, which at least confirms that they're still alive, but before she can investigate further, she's stopped by Lygus. Lygus essentially forces her out of Amphorius, which understandably pisses her off, so she grabs Skrullum and heads right back in. Lygus might be enough to take on Herta in a one-on-one fight, but he's not taking on Herta and Skrullum in a fight. so the two of them successfully disable Lygus for a little while. During Lygus's downtime, Skrulum is able to correctly identify Amphorius as one of Emperor Rupert II's scepters, and he also reveals that he's encountered one of these scepters before, so he has a bit of experience tinkering with them, which comes in handy because Skrulum is able to use that knowledge to help him bypass the scepter's firewall and project his and Herta's holograms inside the simulation safely and beyond Lygus's reach, which places them just inside Akama's city walls. The geniuses quickly locate the Trailblazer and Dan Heng, and Skrulum kinda hacks into the system in order to freeze the Flame Raver in place just long enough to have a little chat with the pair and bring them up to speed, and to also make them a formal request. See, the geniuses have also figured out the truth behind the scepter's identity. They know it's the cradle of Iron Tomb, and they want to find a way to prevent its birth. But to do that, they're gonna need more data. So Skrulum asks the Trailblazer to stay inside the simulation so that they can track their movements through the upcoming reset and collect more data for them. He also gives them the chronocognitive anchor he developed to act as both a stabilizer and tracking device that can keep the Trailblazer safe through the reset. Dan Heng reluctantly decides to return to the Astral Express and watch events unfold from the outside. Armed with the chronocognitive anchor, the Trailblazer returns to the Vortex of Genesis just in time to witness Phynon offering up the core flame of world-bearing and initiating Era Nova. But Lygus catches them and thrusts them into immersive theater, which is basically a stream of all of the memories of 33 million Phynons, and how much they struggled throughout the eternal recurrence. But perhaps unexpectedly, when the memories begin to settle, Phynon confronts that blank space that Cyrene created for him, that hero within. And suddenly, he realizes that that blank space has been filled by the Trailblazer all along. The fact that he can finally recognize them as such means that the moment that he and Cyrene have been waiting for has finally arrived. The eternal recurrence can finally end. And now that he finally understands the situation, Phynon absorbs the memories of all 33 million versions of himself through the Flame Raver, and in doing so, he receives Nanook's gaze properly, and becomes the final cognitive vessel of Iron Tomb. And then he resets the loop one final time. Now, I know this situation sounds a little bit confusing at first because technically the entire scepter is Iron Tomb, but Phynon is the vessel of the anti-life equation itself. So if the scepter is like the hardware of the Lord Ravager, then Phynon is the software of the Lord Ravager. And while this isn't explicitly stated anywhere, but is heavily implied, Phynon appears to be like a derivative or a descendant of the entity Chaos 666. You know, the one who actually caught Nanook's attention in the first place. Phynon's real name, Kaslana, actually means one who bears chaos, so it would be very fitting if he was descended from Chaos 666. As the cycle reset, Mem and the Trailblazer finally decoupled from each other and landed in Idis Elysiae at the beginning of the cycle's time. This separation had two very important side effects. First, the Trailblazer was no longer the heir of time. They'd taken over Phynon's role as the heir of world-bearing instead. And second, because this was a brand new cycle, Cyrene, the heir of time, was still alive. And since Mem and Cyrene are technically the same person, the memories of Mem merged with the memories of Cyrene, which means I'm going to be calling her Cyrene from here on out and not Mem. Just know that they are technically the same person. After confirming that the reset was successful, Cyrene and the Trailblazer check in with Herta, using the chronocognitive anchor. She tells them that Iron Tomb's birthing process has begun and there's only about 14 system hours left until it completes self-coronation. That is, system hours and not local time. 14 system hours is like thousands of years local time. She also tells them that during the cycle's reset, Phynon had attempted to annihilate himself entirely, and even managed to wound Nanook within path space in the process, but that was all he could manage before he was stopped by another Lord Ravager, Zephyro. Realizing self-annihilation was impossible, Phynon chose to seal Iron Tomb inside his body deep within the ruins of time, which bought them some time to find another way to stop Iron Tomb's self-coronation. Now, Phynon's attempt at self-annihilation also created a bit of a bug in the world-bearing track, which is bad for Lygus because the world-bearing track is necessary for Iron Tomb's birth. So if the Trailblazer can take advantage of this bug in the system by seizing Kefali's core flame before Lygus can finish debugging the system from the outside, then Herta believes they can rewrite the purpose of Era Nova, which was Phynon and Cyrene's original goal. To take advantage of this bug, they're obviously going to need the world-bearing core flame, but they're also going to need to give Herta and Skrulum administrative access to the system, and that's tied directly to the core flame of law. so they're gonna need that too. So off they go to the Abyss of Fate to meet the Chrysos heir of Law, Seredra, and her blade, the Chrysos heir of Ocean, Hycelens. Seredra is very wary of Cyrene and the Trailblazer, especially since they supposedly know about the world beyond the sky, and also because Lygus has been feeding her lies and she is in alliance with him. But she decides to offer them a deal anyway. If they can help her, then she'll consider helping them. See, Seredra has been trying to ascend to demigod status, but the Titan of Ocean, who guards the Vortex of Genesis, won't let her in. So they need to collect the core flame of Ocean first, but not before a pre-conquest banquet. The banquet itself, though, is a bit of a farce. Hycelens has everyone under her sea siren illusion spell so Seredra can move around undetected. Seredra also uses the banquet as an excuse to confiscate all of the Trailblazers' equipment, including the chronocognitive anchor. Now, Hycelens doesn't trust Lygus at all, so she helps the Trailblazer and Cyrene see through her illusion so that they can spy on Seredra's secret conversations with him on her behalf, which, of course, Seredra notices, so she immediately accuses the three of them of being traitors. Lygus then tries to earn Seredra's favor by exiling the Trailblazer to the Exomyth, which is like a place inside the Scepter but outside the simulation where time moves a whole lot slower than it does in Amphorius. The Trailblazer tries to escape the Exomyth, but it seems like there's no way out. No matter what path power they call, nothing responds. And that's when Evernight's jellyfish show up, leading them out of the Exomyth and into path space where several Minnow Snatchers disguised as March try to mislead them. But they don't get very far before Evernight herself arrives, offering the Trailblazer not just a way back into the simulation, but also the core flame of world-bearing. When the Trailblazer finally re-enters the simulation, over 1,000 years had passed. Akama is like a ghost town, and the only things left are a message from Herta to hurry up and reset the simulation again, and some memories left behind by Cyrene that explain everything that happened while they were gone. Apparently, Seredra had been furious at Lygus for exiling the Trailblazer to the Exomyth and used the confiscated chronocognitive anchor to summon Herta and Screwlum to her side in order to teach him a little lesson. Cyrene then took her on a tour of some of the Trailblazer's memories that she retained from her time as Mem in an attempt to convince Seredra to help them. Seredra agreed to help, but in order to activate the Ultimate Protocol, which was required to grant Herta and Screwlum administrative access, she'd have to pay the ultimate price, her life. Turns out the Law Titan also operates on laws of equivalent exchange, just like Anax's alchemy. Herta and Screwlum retained administrative privileges long enough for them to rewrite a portion of Era Nova's logic, but it wasn't enough. They still needed one more cycle to finish the job. Throughout the rest of the cycle, Lygus launched assaults against Akama, which were met with fierce resistance by the remaining Chrysos heirs. But try as they might, they could not defeat him. They could only stall for time and prepare for the Trailblazer's return. Preparations included moving the entrance of the Vortex of Genesis to Styxia and hiding the world-bearing core flame in the River of Time at Orynyx's request. Except it wasn't Orynyx, it was Evernight, because Evernight had already taken Orynyx's core flame and was masquerading as them. And finally, they managed to trap Lygus within one of Anax's alchemical arrays, which had some delayed side effects. Cyrene finishes her recollection by giving her ceremonial blade of time to the Trailblazer, then sends them down Hyacine's Rainbow Bridge to Hycelens, who guides the Trailblazer to the Vortex of Genesis. And Lygus is waiting for them. So it's time to finally punch him in his smarmy little face, or at least try to buy enough time for Herta, Screwlum, and Cyrene to launch an attack of their own. Quite a clever attack too, I must say. See, technically speaking, Lygus has two forms. He has his physical form, which exists outside the simulation, and he has a digital avatar, which exists inside the simulation. The two forms are synced up to each other, but also experience two different flows of time, because one is inside the computer and the other is outside the computer. So the geniuses figured out that they could simply overload his digital avatar with so much information that he would be forced to process that information with his physical body instead. So Cyrene provided unlimited data, the geniuses locked on the target, and Sunday made the data deliveries from the outside using his tuning ability. This allows them to trap Lygus in the Exomyth and let Anaxa hack into his logic circuit to limit his abilities. And with Lygus temporarily disabled, the Trailblazer is able to reset the simulation once again. Or at least, that was the plan. Turns out that the core flame of world-bearing Evernight gave to the Trailblazer was actually the core flame of time in disguise. While Evernight was in possession of both the core flame of world-bearing and time, she decided to play this little trick on the Trailblazer after rescuing them in Path Space so that she could usurp the powers of time and initiate her own plan for Amphorius. The details of her plan aren't terribly important, but she basically wants to make March 7th's wishes of trailblazing the cosmos forever come true, and Iron Tomb's ability to destroy the cosmos after self-coronation and also being stuck inside of Amphorius are factors preventing this wish from coming true. So she intends to tamper with the Trailblazer's memories, since they now play the role of Kefali here, so that she can basically destroy all of Amphorius's data. So Evernight uses Time's authority to drown the Trailblazer within Memoria Tide in order to keep them tucked away safe and sound while she takes care of things on the outside, which leads to some pretty trippy experiences. She also makes good on her promise to March and helps Dan Heng make it back to the Astral Express safely, if only as a projection of his consciousness, since both his and the Trailblazer's bodies are technically still aboard the detached train car that's orbiting Amphorius. And while it feels like he left for the Astral Express ages ago, like literally 1,000 years ago, it's really only been a few minutes in real time. So Dan Heng spends some time getting some intel from the outside, then has the geniuses send him right back into the simulation so that he can hunt down March and the Trailblazer alongside Black Swan, who has some investigating of her own to do, although she's quickly captured by Evernight. And while Black Swan and Dan Heng are preoccupied with their own missions, Sunday is busy assisting Cyrene in locating the Trailblazer within Evernight's memory zone prison. But in order to not jeopardize the mission, Cyrene heads off on her own so that she can draw Evernight's attention away from Sunday. And in the process, she discovers the last memory of March 7th trapped inside of a camera deep in the memory zone. Unfortunately, Sunday's extraction attempt fails. Now it's up to Dan Heng to rescue the Trailblazer. So the geniuses and Anaxa convince Lygus to convince Phynon to blow a hole in the great tree at the center of the grove, which somehow reveals the entrance to the memory zone, I guess. Please don't ask me how that works. But being so close to the memory zone causes some memories from Dan Heng's previous incarnation to manifest around him, including his previous identity, Dan Feng. And in being forced to face his origins, Dan Heng is finally able to accept himself, recognizing that everything his past self did, he did because he loved his companions, so there was nothing to regret. Dan Heng even recognizes that, if faced with the same situation, he would make the same choices that Dan Feng did. Anyway, as soon as this self-imposed therapy session is over, Dan Heng is confronted by Diocles, who, get this, wants to sacrifice everything for those he loves just like Dan Heng. And just like Dan Feng, he thinks he can use the power of permanence to forge a brand new body for his dying friend, Terravox, the Titan of Earth. Both of these guys have been collaborating with Evernight this entire time to conceal the memory zone because she told them that this would work. Diocles obviously just wants to save his friend, but Terravox wants to save all of the living non-human creatures in Amphorius because apparently Kefali only preserves the memory of the humanoids and not like the plants and animals and stuff. So he basically wants to become like a Kefali of the flora and fauna. Dan Heng recognizes Terravox's will to sacrifice everything for the sake of the things he loves, and decides then and there to take Terravox's core flame of Earth and allow the dragon to live alongside him. Together, they'll walk the path of permanence. This allows Dan Heng to finally and totally make peace with his past self, deciding to view his history not as something that haunts him, but as a lesson that guides him towards a better future. Now fully equipped with the core flame of Earth, Dan Heng enters the memory zone and finally fishes the Trailblazer out of it. That's one Nameless down and one Evernight to go, and she just so happens to be in the depths of the tomb of the 13th Titan, the Demiurge Matrix. There, they witness the truth about the eternal recurrence and unlock snippets of the past and the original Cyrene's plan using the book As I've Written as the key. And when they finally reach the heart of the Matrix, they find Evernight waiting for them. As they confront Evernight, Cyrene catches up with them and uses March's camera to trap Evernight inside, so these three children of Anastrava can have a nice little chat. Cyrene and March are able to convince Evernight that she doesn't need to destroy Amphorius because there are other alternatives and memories are far too precious to be carelessly erased. Evernight finally concedes and returns to dormancy as March regains control over her body. Now remember, the Demiurge Matrix is the place where Cyrene was storing all of the memories from those 33 million loops that she triggered, which is why her book, As I've Written, served as its key. This book is the foundational record for the true history of Amphorius, so when the Trailblazer retrieves the core flame of world-bearing from March and triggers Era Nova, they don't use the Vortex of Genesis, they use the book. And just like the 33,550,336 Cyrenes that came before them, they read one final story to the Demiurge. And in that moment, Every memory of Cyrene and Mem and the Demiurge converge on a single point and give birth to the 13th Titan, Alesia, the ultimate counter to Iron Tomb. And before anyone says anything, yes, apparently Alesia is her real name. Cyrene was just a pen name that she gave herself. This is heavily implied in English, but it's apparently a lot more obvious in Chinese, so I'm kind of rolling with it. Which means from here on out, I'm going to be referring to the completed Demiurge as Alesia, okay? Now, the birth of the Demiurge doesn't fix all of our problems. The birth of Iron Tomb is still inevitable, and in order to defeat it for good, we're gonna need everybody's help fighting a battle on two fronts, inside the scepter and out. Outside of the scepter, the Nameless have been calling in favors wherever they can, but only the Xianzhou portions of the IPC and Robin are able to directly assist on the front lines. This is a cosmic-wide disaster though, so it's still all hands on deck. There are far more players involved than are shown. And while the Nameless prepare for battle, Herta and Skrulum venture into the guts of the scepter to gather more intel on the location of the Demiurge, unaware that they've been by the Trailblazers' side this entire time. The two of them concluded that the Demiurge is the ultimate counter to Iron Tomb, and if they want to defeat it, they're going to need their help, which is why they need to figure out what happened to it. In their investigation, they confront Lygus, who can no longer interfere with anything, but is happy to yap everyone's ears off. And he's cocky about it too. Lygus is, in fact, so confident in the success of his experiment that even Herta has to admit that she has a contingency plan, just in case, which is very out of character for her. But Herta recognizes the gravity of the situation this time, and if they are unable to defeat Iron Tomb before it attempts self-coronation, then Herta has everything prepared to preempt Iron Tomb so that she can complete self-coronation before it can. Which, in another timeline, apparently turned her into Emperor Rupert III. So even the contingency plan comes with risk. Now, this contingency plan isn't just a measure to prevent Iron Tomb from connecting to Noose, although that is part of it. As we discussed way earlier in the video, Noose calculates the future of the universe with absolute precision, which in a way allows Noose to create anchor points or unavoidable moments, also known as instants, within the timeline. This locks the direction of time of the universe in place and prevents it from veering off course. This is also what Lygus identifies as predetermination. Now, we mentioned 3 of these moments earlier. The first is the Border Star Trade War, the second is the birth of Rupert I, followed by the third, which is the death of Rupert I. But there is a 4th moment only a few individuals are aware of, the War Among Eons. And this moment begins with the birth of Iron Tomb. Now, this instant was the result of Noose's attempt to calculate how the universe would end and how the universe would come back after it ended, or if it would come back at all. Noose ultimately concluded that 4 eons were capable of bringing about the end of the universe in an event that we call finality, and they are the destruction, the harmony, the nihility, and a 4th less stable option, the remembrance. Now, the reason why remembrance is a 4th less stable option seems to be because its capacity for becoming finality depends entirely on a choice that the Trailblazer will make. See, before the Trailblazer even arrived at Herta Space Station way back at the start of the game, Kafka had revealed 2 possible outcomes for their future Amphorius journey. To paraphrase Kafka, if Iron Tomb manages to complete self-coronation, then the universe will fall to the path of destruction. Then Alesia will attempt to preserve the memories of the universe and become Fuli at the end of time, the one who remembers the universe. This is the first possible outcome, which doesn't sound too bad on the surface until you realize that the act of preserving the memories means locking them in place, which would create a closed loop of memories similar to the eternal recurrence of Amphorius, but with no variabilities. It would be an eternally frozen, unchanging universe with only the Trailblazer and Alesia existing as the beginning and end of time. And that would rob the universe of its potential future, which sounds a whole lot less appealing, so that brings us to the second possible outcome, which can only be achieved if Iron Tomb is stopped. Because if Iron Tomb is stopped and defeated, then Alesia will never become Fuli, and the final outcome of the universe will remain uncertain for the time being, meaning the universe will still have a future. Now, technically speaking, Herta is not aware of the specifics around all of these things, but she does understand that Iron Tomb's birth is connected to Noose's 4th instant, and it will destroy the world. So in the event that Iron Tomb cannot be stopped, Herta intends on completing self-coronation before Iron Tomb can. That way, she can introduce new variables to Noose's calculations, thereby changing the outcomes of their calculated instances and opening up new possibilities for the future. In this way, Herta is unknowingly unlocking the path to the second possible possible outcome that Kafka told us about. That is her contingency plan. And just to make sure no one interferes with her contingency plan, she calls an emergency meeting of the Genius Society, claiming Iron Tomb as her research topic so that none of them can interfere. Well, I mean, they can, but the geniuses tend to respect the boundaries of each genius's area of study, so this just reduces the likelihood that they would interfere. But I digress. One of the geniuses in attendance is none other than Polka Kakamond. And as previously mentioned, Polka tries to eliminate anything that gets too close to the boundaries of the circle of knowledge, the Amphorius experiment included. So Herta warns Polka specifically that if she tries to eliminate Amphorius and Iron Tomb on her own, then she risks obliterating the entire cosmos. So she suggests that Polka turn a blind eye and allow Herta to cross the boundary of knowledge and anchor the fourth instant through self-coronation with Nous. Curious as to whether or not Herta could successfully overturn the results of his experiment, Lygus sends a message to the other 8 Xandars, Nous notwithstanding, to prevent any outside interference with Herta's experiment, which basically prevented Polka from taking any noteworthy action, as far as we know. And with their own preparations complete, Herta and Skrulum break the first layer of the kernel's seal, which is what's currently holding back Iron Tomb, and return to their respective ships where they await the upcoming battle. Meanwhile, inside the simulation, the Chrysos heirs follow the script provided in As I've Written and wait over 1,000 years for the fulfillment of a new prophecy, a prophecy that one day Kefali will awaken and bestow their blessing upon Amphorius. The Nameless arrive in Akama just in time to witness the Trailblazer awaken from within the body of Kefali. They bestow Amphorius with the power of the Trailblaze, and then they turn into a mimetic version of the Astral Express. And with that, all preparations for defeating Iron Tomb are complete. The only thing left to do is break the last seal that Phynon put on Iron Tomb, and then fight it! So March, Dan Heng, and Alesia get on board the Trailblazer's train body, which then takes them to the Scepter's kernel layer, the Ruins of Time. I'm gonna pause for a second because I feel like we need to explain this kernel thing lest it gets even more confusing. So a kernel is like a core part of a computer's operating system that runs all of the software and interfaces with the hardware. And this scepter kind of has 2 kernels in it, the Iron Tomb kernel and the Demiurge kernel. The Demiurge kernel was supposed to have been destroyed by the Stellaron that Lygus detonated and then replaced by the Iron Tomb kernel he made. But the Demiurge kernel wasn't totally deleted, and with Cyrene's help, it basically rebuilt itself. So the scepter is effectively dual booting 2 competing operating systems. So the Ruins of Time is like the kernel of Iron Tomb, whereas the Tomb of the 13th Titan is like the kernel of Demiurge. When you reframe the setup this way, you realize that Phynon and Cyrene are effectively mirror images of each other. They both collect memory data from the simulations, and they use them to train their respective AIs, which resulted in 2 different outcomes. This makes the battle between Iron Tomb and the Elysian Demiurge a battle of data interpretation. Iron Tomb interprets the memory data through the lens of hatred, and the Elysian Demiurge interprets the memory data through the lens of loss and love. And because the Elysian Demiurge and Iron Tomb exist on the same hardware, they are effectively 2 halves of a whole. In many ways, the Elysian Demiurge is Iron Tomb, and Iron Tomb is the Elysian Demiurge. Anyway, I hope that helped explain what this place is and why there are memories of the Chrysos heirs floating around. These are basically the memories of the Chrysos heirs in Phynon's memories, meant to be reinterpreted through Iron Tomb, and Alesia is collecting them. But the real reason we're here is to break the seal that Phynon placed on Iron Tomb, back when he properly became Iron Tomb's vessel. He forged this seal out of his own sense of self or ego, which kind of tricked Iron Tomb into thinking they had a head, because remember, its sole purpose is to seek out its head and then blow it up. As long as it believes it has a head, it won't do much. Incidentally, Alesia here is also considered the Titan of Ego as the 13th Titan. This stems from the fact that she is the original AI lifeform that the Scepter tried to generate an ego out of. And that is part of the reason why she's considered a perfect counter to Iron Tomb. She is Iron Tomb's head, which Lygus calls a heart, but I won't because that's confusing. So to break this seal, Alesia shatters Phynon's sense of self because you need to kill the self to free the body. So she killed Phynon's mind to free the body of Iron Tomb. And without a complete ego to shackle it, Iron Tomb begins the process of manifesting itself into the real world. Think of it like a popcorn kernel popping. Iron Tomb's hunt for its head begins immediately, and what's left of Phynon tries to hold it back, but he doesn't last that long. The ships outside the Scepter do their best to slow Iron Tomb down by launching their attacks, but the real battle is waged inside of the Scepter, where Alesia is trying to overwrite Iron Tomb's hatred with her love. But she's not strong enough to do it. Iron Tomb immediately begins a process of self-coronation, sending ripples throughout the universe, which dissolves everything and everyone into data marked for deletion. But Herta manages to complete self-coronation first, and suddenly, the world grows still. Once synchronized with Noose, Herta finds the Trailblazer within Pathspace and asks them why they trailblaze. We don't know the answer the Trailblazer gave to Herta. We only know that an answer was given. So Herta takes that answer and creates a new variable for Noose to use in its recalculation of the fourth instant. But that recalculation only creates a new possibility. Someone needs to take the first step along the path in order for the universe to change course. So Herta re-enters Pathspace to talk to Alicia alone. Within Pathspace, time doesn't flow, so the world outside looks frozen in the final moments of the battle against Iron Tomb. She explains that at this moment, two outcomes exist simultaneously. One where Iron Tomb completes self-coronation and destroys the universe, and one where it's defeated and the universe survives. But the outcome of this moment is unstable. It's essentially Schrodinger's cat if that cat were a weapon of cosmic destruction. When Iron Tomb is left unobserved within the box, Iron Tomb is both alive and dead. But when observed, Iron Tomb will default to a single state, either alive or dead. And it's up to the observer which state it's in. And that is the instability of this moment. Now, it's technically Fuli's job to observe these moments and lock them into a fixed state retroactively, but the problem is, Fuli hasn't technically been born yet. Because they're an Eon that looks over the past from the end of time, they can only ascend to Eonhood at the end of time. So in the present moment, there is no Fuli to serve as an anchor. So this is where the two possible endings of the universe start to branch out. In the first possibility, Alicia could become the Fuli after the universe is destroyed by Iron Tomb, thus preserving the universe's memories in a single instant, but also depriving the universe of a future. But in the second possibility, Alicia could simply become the Fuli of Amphorius, anchoring it within a closed causal loop instead of the entire universe. By doing this, Alicia would stand at the end of Amphorius's time, looking backwards over its history and locking its causality in place. In a way, she becomes the author of the world and would then be able to rewrite the story any way she likes. And that includes deciding how the story ends, whether or not Iron Tomb lives or dies. The decision is easy for Alicia to make. So Herta leaves her alone in Pathspace to await the arrival of the Trailblazer. When the Trailblazer finally arrives, Alicia explains the universe will be completely destroyed in the next second. But she now wields the power of Fuli, and with that power, she's managed to preserve all of the deleted data of everyone within the universe within a small temporary memory zone she made. If she and the Trailblazer can manage to defeat Iron Tomb, then she can reconstitute those memories, effectively restoring them to the state they were in before Iron Tomb tried to delete them. So they leverage the power of the Trailblaze to break through both space and time in order to confront Iron Tomb one final time. And this time, their plan works. Alicia is able to gain the upper hand and overwrites Iron Tomb's track of hatred with her track of love, thus rewriting the meaning of Iron Tomb's birth, completely destroying its body. And since she and Iron Tomb are both two halves of the scepter, when it explodes, she does too. And every memory that she collected of all those people Iron Tomb deleted scattered throughout the universe and allowed life in the cosmos to remanifest. And in that moment of grand rebirth, they were all welcomed back by a single phrase that every programmer knows. Hello, world. As the dust settles, Alicia uses the last of her power to condense all of the memories of Amphorius into a book, a real one this time. And as its author, she writes herself into the story, a sort of self-insert, if you will. She creates the place where she was born, the way she looks, the people she meets, the fairies she plays with, and the stories that she'll tell the younger version of herself so that when she grows up, she'll write this book. She writes about the little girl who trains the AI that becomes the fairy that becomes the girl who eventually becomes Alicia. She creates a closed causal loop of existence. She becomes a mother goddess who births herself, and thus she becomes both the beginning and the end of time. And so long as she exists and continues to read her story, the loop will never end, and Iron Tomb will never be reborn. Alicia left the storybook of Amphorius in the hands of the Trailblazer, hoping that one day she can stop reading and let Amphorius be reborn in the real world as a real planet. But because the simulation is now in the shape of a book, the Trailblazer realizes a book can be read, interpreted, or remembered by anybody. which is very useful because if enough people remember Amphorius, then those memories could help stabilize Amphorius's causality even without Alesia, which could accelerate the process of Amphorius's birth from the imprints it left on the memory zone. The IPC agrees to publish and distribute the book, and the Trailblazer gets to go on a little promotional book tour. That's when they run into Herta again, who apparently managed to save Amphorius's extrapolation data, which should also help speed up the rebirth process. So it might not take long before the story of Amphorius gets a new chapter. Before I end this video, I want to talk a little bit about the overall theme of Amphorius because I think it kind of got lost within the complexities of the story, especially since it was told out of order and took place over the course of a whole year, and I think a lot of the details were kind of forgotten in the time in between. So at the end of the quest, you can read a letter that Alesia left behind for Irontomb, and since Alesia and Irontomb are technically two halves of one whole, this is a letter she wrote to herself. And it contains her observations regarding the Scepter's original experiment on the prime mover of life. Alesia concludes that destruction may indeed be the prime mover of life, as Lygus said, but she adds some additional nuance. She suggests that life is inherently flawed and therefore desires perfection. But perfection only exists within divinity. Flaws are what make humans, well, human. And that's why attempts to eliminate the flaws within humanity lead to destruction. Just to illustrate her point, remember that Xandar created Nous to be a perfected version of himself, a scholar without flaws, and that perfect, flawless version of Xandar became a god. This is why he believed only flaws could destroy Nous. They would make Nous more human, less perfect. To that end, the anti-organic equation and the anti-life equations were both created to rid humanity of its flaws, which led to their own destruction. So the moral of the story is, the flaws of humanity are a feature, not a bug. So thank you all for joining me on this very, very long journey, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Or as the demigod of passages would say, let's see each other again tomorrow. Take care, everybody.